Welcome back, everybody. Bringing us in a dub-wise fashion. Keeping it on the dub tip. Today focusing on the mixing of Errol Thompson, aka the man like E.T. or Errol T. Dropping the vocals in and out of the mix. Bringing the percussion forward and forward the bass. This is the third part of my series looking at dub within the development of reggae music. If you haven't checked out the first two episodes, please do so. Now, as King Tubby's studio became an epicenter of dub mixing, it was never a recording studio per se. He didn't have enough room to have a full band in there, though he did eventually have a voicing booth in a converted bathroom. But as far as the tracks being mixed, other producers would bring their tracks to him, where he would remix them into dub mixes, and they could then be spun off into DJ mixes, instrumentals, what have you. Strictly a remixing studio in the beginning, but other studios that had their own facilities could also record a band, record a song, and then have the engineer mix it. And many of the other dub mixers involved in the development of dub were also recording engineers. One such was the man Errol Thompson, who grew up in Kingston, Jamaica, had an uncle who was very interested in electronics, ran a little sound system. So it was there that he got exposed to the power of electronics within recorded music. He served a short apprenticeship at Studio One in the late 1960s. Didn't stay there long, but apparently one of his very first recording sessions as a recording engineer, that is the man at the desk committing the song to tape, was Max Romeo's rude hit Wet Dream, which was a big hit in the UK for producer Bunny Lee. Apparently incurred the ire of Studio One head Coxsone Dodd, did not approve of the subject matter, risque. Following that, Thompson would link up with a school friend, Clive Chin. Clive's family ran a record shop called Randy's at 17 North Parade in downtown Kingston, and above the shop they also had a recording studio, also called Randy's. Which was becoming a bustling epicenter, bustling studio, lots of up-and-coming producers recording their tracks there. They brought in Errol Thompson as recording engineer, that is the man at the desk recording the songs as the bands come in to record their tracks. Thompson rewired the studio, gave it a clean, well-balanced sound that appealed to many producers, became a bustling recording studio. One of the among many sessions he recorded was Bob Marley and the Wailers' work with Lee Perry, the classic Lee Perry sessions, some of them appearing on this compilation, Rasta Revolution, on Trojan Records, early 1970s, recording engineer Errol Thompson at Randy's studio. As the studio got busier and busier with many producers wanting to use their services, bring their music, record their music there, the Chin family also got more heavily into producing their own music using their own studio. Of course, they didn't have to pay for studio time, they owned it. Clive, the young son of the family, got more and more interested in production with his school chum Errol Thompson at his side. They soon linked up with Augustus Pablo. Very young Augustus Pablo was just getting a start in music after some initial sessions for Herman Chin Loy. They put out his debut album, This Is Augustus Pablo. There's Errol Thompson at the mixing desk right there. Augustus Pablo, Clive Chin in the back, recording. Debut album for Augustus Pablo contained his first sizable hit called Java, which really put him on the map, engineered by Errol Thompson and co-produced between him and Clive Chin. Between the two of them, they were also responsible for one of the very first dub LPs to hit the market, Java, 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 again, extrapolating off that big hit for Augustus Pablo called Java on the Impact label. It always comes out upside down, never fails. The Impact label, one of the Randy's house labels. At this time, Thompson was also working as recording engineer. Dub mixing, just kind of a sideline at this point, wasn't really a proven market yet, but he was a recording engineer, has a staggering amount of credits of classic reggae songs and albums that he was at the desk recording as they were recorded, as they were laid down. Following these sections, eventually in the mid-70s, Errol Thompson would leave Randy's under somewhat acrimonious circumstances. He would go off to another producer, Joe Gibbs, who had established a more advanced studio of his own at Retirement Crescent in Kingston. The Joe Gibbs studio would then kick into high gear, and unfortunately, Randy's was never able to fully recover from the loss of Errol Thompson. They would eventually close down the studio in around 1977, 1978. The Chin family eventually relocating to the New York area, where they founded the VP Records empire. Turned out very well for them. But there were some hard feelings, especially when the iconic Marcus Garvey album for Burning Spear was recorded. His landmark album appeared in 1975, 76-ish. The tracks were recorded at Randy's, but sent to Joe Gibbs to be mixed by Errol Thompson at Joe Gibbs Recording Studio, Retirement Crescent. Errol Thompson led to somewhat acrimonious feelings, unfortunately. But Errol Thompson kicked into high gear while at the desk at Joe Gibbs' studio. Him and Joe Gibbs formed a partnership that would come to be known as the Mighty Two and would fuel much classic reggae through the second half of the 1970s and into the 1980s, where they were basically neck and neck with the other leading studio, Channel One. The two of them had, Channel One had its house band called the Revolutionaries. Joe Gibbs had their band called the Professionals, shared a lot of the same players, kind of a rotating, fluid membership, but basically neck and neck between the two of them through the 70s. And the secret weapon behind Joe Gibbs' studio was Errol Thompson at the controls, basically functioning as the hands-on producer, with Joe Gibbs more as the financer, the organizer, though he did have an electronics background himself. The first effort Errol Thompson mixed for Joe Gibbs was another very early dub LP, Dub Serial. The original release of this is very, very rare, very expensive. This is a more recent repressing through Greensleeves label. Dub Serial. Now, Joe Gibbs, along with Channel One, relied on reusing a lot of vintage rhythms, which was kind of one of the nostalgia factor or one of the hallmarks of dub, the recycling of old familiar tracks that were known to the listener. They would recognize a tune, recognize a melody, and then the dub mixer could put a new spin on it, put a new mix, fade in the vocals in and out, add special effects, isolate the percussion, things like that. Just give it a new, old rhythm tracks that had proven their value, could be recycled, given a fresh lick of paint. Bunny Lee had been quite instrumental in doing this, reusing rhythm tracks over and over again, but Channel One and Joe Gibbs especially took it to a new level, reusing and updating a lot of these classic tracks from the late 1960s, from the rocksteady era, giving them a new sound, updated sound for the times. Continuing on the dub tip, from the mid-70s on, Errol Thompson and Joe Gibbs put out the African Dub series. This is the first volume, African Dub Almighty. This is a early UK pressing on the Lightning label. African Dub Almighty, mixed by Errol Thompson with Joe Gibbs. Joe Gibbs production, solid gold. Indeed it was. The African Dub series started out fairly minimal in mixing. Again, reusing a lot of familiar rhythm tracks, a lot of classic tracks that supported vocal hits of the day. They would then take the basic backing track, remix it into a dub style. This continued on to Chapter 2. There was a whole series of these. Shout out to Fisher Hi-Fi. This is a Joe Gibbs Record Globe label, the classic Joe Gibbs label. Again, Lots of familiar rhythm tracks. As time went on, as the series went on, Errol Thompson's mixing got a bit more outlandish. He would mix in sound effects like flushing toilets, ringing telephones in later volumes of the series, like Chapter 3 particularly. These volumes would be, there's the US Joe Gibbs label there. These volumes would become increasingly popular in the UK market, where they crossed over outside the reggae market, particularly to the punks who were tuned into these African dub volumes. Apparently one shop that got in some advanced copies of one of the African dub LPs was burgled just to get the LP copy. Something like 25 copies were stolen. This is African Dub Chapter 4. By now it's about 1978, 79-ish. There was a volume 5 that didn't appear until much later into the 1980s. Very obscure one. It's included on Evolution of Dub, which was put out through Greensleeves several years ago. This is volume 4, which focuses on Joe Gibbs productions. Also, somewhere in between the African Dub series, Joe Gibbs and Errol Thompson put out State of Emergency. Iconic cover there, reflecting the increasingly tense situation in Kingston, Jamaica. Police checkpoint there. This is more instrumental than dub. There was also a set called Majestic Dub that appeared. Again, very similar mixing style to the African Dub series, although starting to move with the times, incorporate some disco sounds in the mix. US Joe Gibbs label there again with the palm trees and the island. Excellent dub album. I also have the recent reissue of this, fairly recent, which has some different tracks from the US original there. Errol Thompson at the controls for all these albums. It should be noted, as well as putting out dub, he was also the recording engineer part of the Mighty 2 production, the Joe Gibbs and Errol Thompson productions. So he was the one basically recording, some would say producing, certainly producing in the traditional sense, all the classic material coming from Joe Gibbs' studio at this time, which included Culture's iconic 2/7's Clash LP, one of the top reggae LPs of all time. Their work with Dennis Brown also set new standards for his work. Visions of Dennis Brown, one of the iconic productions, again on the Joe Gibbs US label. One of his very best albums. Recorded at Joe Gibbs Recording Studio, 24 Retirement Crescent. Their work with Dennis Brown helped him get a recording contract with a major label, A&M. Joe Gibbs had a link with Warner Brothers also. And also Errol Thompson's mixing and production appeared on all the Joe Gibbs singles. Here's one of the classic 12-inch sleeves with Culture's Zion Gate and Zion Rock, Joe Gibbs and the Professionals on the back. All these featuring the recording, engineering, and mixing of Errol Thompson. One of my favorite mixes of his is the dub side of Dennis Brown's classic hit for Joe Gibbs, Money in My Pocket, the Joe Gibbs Record Globe label. On the flip side, Running's Irie, Errol Thompson starts out with a fairly straightforward rhythm mix as the rhythm goes on, and then in the middle of the tune, when you least expect it, all of a sudden he drops in the vocals, and the effect is startling, with the DJ version by Prince Mohammed kicking in. Errol Thompson's mixes were very different from King Tubby's, especially in the Randy's days. He was reliant on pushing buttons, whereas King Tubby, with his electronic skill, was able to customize his equipment, use sliding faders. But Errol Thompson definitely kicked in with some inspired mixes, fading in vocals, sound effects, creative use of dialogue interludes, all kinds of these funny asides. Definitely a sense of humor to his work. Some people don't like that style of mixing with the toilets flushing sound effects and stuff. I find it fun stuff. There's an excellent compilation of dubs from the Mighty 2 production house called No Bones for the Dogs, which appeared on the Pressure Sounds label. All Errol Thompson mixes. Errol Thompson was also responsible for Althea and Donna's massive hit, Uptown Top Ranking. There's the UK Lightning label again. He basically produced that, though it appeared under the Joe Gibbs umbrella. He also got his own sub-label called Errol T after himself. Kind of hard to see on that one. Now, following the early 80s, as they moved with the times, incorporated some disco, some soca in the Mighty Two productions, again, moving with the times. The singer called J.C. Lodge had covered a Charlie Pride song called Someone Loves You, Honey. Unfortunately, it was an unauthorized cover, very common situation in Jamaican music, but Joe Gibbs got caught, got penalized, ended up having to shut down his recording facilities in the early 1980s. They were out of the music business for about a decade and focused on a grocery store business in downtown Kingston, which Errol Thompson managed for Joe Gibbs. So they continued working together for many, many years, even outside the music industry. Errol Thompson very loyal to Joe Gibbs. In the 1990s, they got back into the music to a certain extent. In the early 2000s, 2004, Errol Thompson mixed the Hard Times rhythm for Gibbs's son Gibbo, Stephen Gibbs' label, Gibbo, the Hard Times rhythm, which appeared in the early 2000s. Here's one hit which appeared on that rhythm track in 2005, Living in Love. Unfortunately, this would be the final mixing work of Errol Thompson, who passed away from a series of strokes shortly after. But definitely one of the prime innovators behind dub. So that has been my look at the man, Errol T, the iconic yet somewhat little known dub mixer, recording engineer, responsible for a staggering amount of classic reggae, classic dub. Hope you've enjoyed, guys. The series will continue in future volumes. Thanks for tuning in. Peace.